We're here to talk about older people and domestic abuse. We are part of something called the Older People's Project, which is a collaboration between the Women's Centre in Cornwall and Age UK in Cornwall, but it actually covers the whole of the South West Peninsula. So it covers Devon, Cornwall, Torbay and Plymouth. And it's a piece of work that's commissioned, which is a joint partnership of the Safer Communities Group, covering the issues against violence against women and girls, which is known as the EOS board. So I'm Jo Hickson, I'm the project lead, and I'm employed by the Women's Centre, and my colleagues Aileen Feasy and Val Stanley, who are employed by Age UK Cornwall. We're all over 60 and we are survivors of domestic abuse ourselves. I just wanted to do a bit of a trigger warning because we are going to be talking about some sensitive material, and the case studies we're going to share a bit later on are quite hard-hitting, and we've had feedback from people to say that they really appreciate us sharing them and that they are in some ways the best part of this, but they are quite hard-hitting. So, you know, if you don't feel comfortable staying, please do leave. But, you know, feel free to reach out to us as well, and do seek some support. So we're going to talk a bit about national research and the data, facts, figures and stats. Val's going to talk about the Older People's Project Phase 1, which took place in Cornwall, which Val and Aileen both worked in, but I came in when Phase 2 started. Aileen's going to talk about Phase 2, and then we're going to, we've got some information on some sort of trauma-informed responses, and we'll have a look at that and see how you feel about us going through that, whether you feel it's relevant or not. We don't want to be teaching people to suck eggs, so if you're all well trauma-informed practitioners, it may be a bit basic, but we do have that, and we've got time for questions and discussions. So, bit about the terminology that we're using. So sometimes people are described as victims, sometimes as survivor, and people who've experienced domestic abuse feel have different views about the terms used. So generally, we use a person who has experienced domestic abuse. But I am going to use the term somewhat interchangeably here, and you'll see why as we go along. But the preferred way of describing people is people who've experienced domestic abuse. But if you say victim of domestic abuse, what image does that bring to mind? This is the images that came up on Google when I asked for images of victims of domestic abuse. They were universally young white women, sometimes including young children, sometimes depicting male violence. And one image was of a black man grabbing the arm of a white woman, which I thought was very sus. But they're all stereotypical images of young white women with young children, often in a lower income bracket, high school education at best, maybe chaotic lifestyle, and a male partner who's physically violent. It's not an uncommon stereotype, but it does mean that people experiencing abuse who don't fit this stereotype often miss out on the support available, or sometimes the support available doesn't meet their needs, or they think it won't, so they don't reach out and seek help. For older people, domestic abuse is quite often framed as elder abuse, which leads to a pathway through adult social care rather than through domestic abuse services, and leading to people not necessarily getting the support they need. And if you don't fit the stereotype in other ways, if you're being older, intersects with other marginal identities, it's even harder for someone to recognise that it's domestic abuse. So if you're male, if you're from an ethnic minority background, or if you're in a same-sex relationship. So these are some of the statistics. And there is quite a bit of national research around domestic abuse in the older people that's been conducted more recently. So 1 in 6 adults over 60 living in the community experience domestic abuse, and people over 60 account for 1 in 4 domestic homicides in the UK, but half of these were killed by their adult children. Only 3% of those experiencing abuse over 60 were accessing an IDVA, which is an independent domestic violence advisor, and there are ISVAs as well, sexual violence advisors, and that's a very small amount, and clearly that's not meeting the need. So we're going to come back and look at why that might be an issue later. So if you think about statistics in the southwest, the 60 plus population across the southwest, so that's Cornwall, Devon, Plymouth and Torbay, was 575,589. So 1 in 6 of that suggests there are nearly 96,000 people over 60 experiencing domestic abuse in the southwest. That's a lot of people. So what might be different? What makes domestic abuse in the older population different from that experienced by younger people? Well, the abuse might be perpetrated by adult children or grandchildren. And for a parent, that might be really hard to admit. I think mothers in particular feel they get a double whammy of judgment, both from being a victim of the abuse and as the parent of a child who would perpetrate abuse. So the parent may not want to report their child if the child has issues, might be poor mental health, financial worries, housing issue, addiction worries, or care needs, and the parent might feel that those are going to be made worse if the abuse was reported. The parent may feel responsible for the child. One of the women we've been working with as part of the project reported that her son would use her grandchildren as bargaining tool. She didn't give him money or food, he'd refused to let her see them. And risk assessments in particular, so the DASH forms that are used, don't take account of this, don't take account of the fact that it may not be your intimate partner. So the perpetrator might also be in poor health, and the person experiencing the abuse may be their carer. And so despite being abused, they may not want to leave because they're worried about who's going to care for that person if they leave. And the perpetrator might be considered to be too old or too frail to be an abuser by people who are assessing them. And the other way around, the person experiencing the abuse may have poor health and the perpetrator might be the carer. So do they have the opportunity to tell someone if their perpetrator and carer is always there? How are they going to manage on their own? Who will look after them if the perpetrator goes? And there are lots of subtle ways, opportunities for abuse around medication, about food, and about how and where care is provided. And we'll come to some of this, examples of this in the case studies. So dementia might be an issue. And it could be, it's not uncommon for a perpetrator to suggest the person they're abusing has mental health issues. That happens throughout the age spectrum. And that's why they're saying these things, because their mental health's poor. But if there's a genuine dementia diagnosis, that can lead to people believing that. Sometimes a diagnosis of dementia can lead to a change of behaviour, and it's important to check with people if the abuse has started after the diagnosis or after they've started experiencing symptoms, or has it been there all along but it's just become more obvious after the diagnosis. The relationship could be very long-standing. If you've been married to someone for many years, the thought of leaving everything behind, family, friends, property, income, a whole life together, that might be really daunting. And families might put pressure on the victim not to leave and to keep the status quo. If you think about people living in rural areas, isolation is a real issue. But if you own a farm with your perpetrator, if you leave, who's going to look after the animals? So if you've got pets, there are charities that will arrange foster care for your pets if you need to go in a refuge. They can't arrange foster care for a herd of cows. So that's a big issue. The person experiencing abuse might have dealt with the death of a partner or a divorce after a long relationship and is going back to dating after many years of being in a healthy relationship, which might make them more vulnerable to abuse if they're lonely or they're unaware of the risks of things like romance scams or even understanding what domestic abuse is, what it's about. Like I mentioned before, rural isolation has an impact, and that's a risk factor for all ages, but it might be even more so for someone who's older, who's maybe given up driving or struggles to access public transport. And like I said before, the impact of other intersectionalities. If you're an older gay man who grew up at a time when gay sex was illegal, how comfortable would you feel telling anyone? If you're a Muslim female, would you feel that services are going to be able to meet your needs? And when black males are framed as the aggressor, are you going to be believed when you're the victim? So I'm going to hand over to to Val, who's going to talk about phase 1 of the Older People's Project.
Thank you, Jo. Good morning, everyone. I'm Val Stanley, and I'm a community engagement facilitator for the project. Phase 1 of the Older People's Project ran from May 2022 to August 2023. And what we wanted to do was to collect evidence from older survivors, both men and women, with lived experiences of domestic abuse and sexual violence. What we wanted to do was to develop a better understanding of what they've experienced and what older people want from services. We wanted to understand what the barriers were to older people seeking help from services. And we wanted to look at what a good, responsive domestic abuse, sexual violence service in Cornwall and Devon would look like. Again, for both men and for women. And we wanted to find the best ways to communicate with older people. That would be including issues like language to use and how to target communication about services to this demographic. So we had quite a lot of aims to fulfill. And Jo, can you put the next slide up? Thank you. What we found from phase 1 was a lack of recognition that relationships are abusive. And I think Jo's already mentioned that a lot of people in domestic abuse relationships don't even realise that they are in an abusive relationship. Belief that services are just for younger people or for people with young children. And there's a strong belief by men that services are for women and not for men. There's a limited awareness of services and the options available to them and how they even might access those services and what do they offer them. And there was a reluctance to share services, particularly housing with younger women and men. And we actually found that out because we did go and do quite a lot of consultation in refuges and housing associations and things like that, although there are differing opinions about that as well. And importantly, what we found was that older people felt they wouldn't be believed. So I'm going to pass you over to Jo again, who will tell you about, oh no, to Aileen, sorry, who will tell you about phase 2 of the project.
Hello, my name's Aileen Feasy. I'm also a facilitator with the group. Phase 2, which we extended over to over the peninsula to Devon, and it's really about what have we been doing, what are we doing? Well, we're developing a charter for services, organisations and agencies to support older people affected by domestic abuse and sexual violence with experts by experience groups. We're developing an older people's communications strategy, developing trauma. Sorry, there's sort of a noise in the background. Developing training for services and organisations, hoping to update the risk assessment process and apply this to older people, and make sure there's appropriate safe accommodation meeting older people's needs. What we've heard so far from our experts by experiences group, as you will see on the slide there, one of the most important was ask me. I wanted to be asked. Believe me, don't make assumptions about me. I'm older, I've got to put up with it. We make different choices from younger women and men because of how many years perhaps we've been together with somebody. And don't assume all carers are safe. Some are, but some are very abusive, manipulative and controlling. This is what we found so far.
Lovely, thanks Aileen. So we've got a series of trauma-informed responses. Now this is where I didn't want, we know we're in a group of people who are skilled in trauma-informed responses. So I don't necessarily want to go through this if people feel they need it, but this is some of the, what do people feel? Would they like us to go through this? We've got sort of 4 examples.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Lovely, we will. So these are some of the responses that you might get. So a service user doesn't show up for their appointment or their session. They don't return calls and they arrive late. So a non-trauma informed response might be service users avoidant, lazy, irresponsible, doesn't care about their support and is disrespectful of the service. Where trauma-informed understanding might be survivors frequently experience sleep disturbances and hyperarousal, which can make keeping track of appointments, particularly attending early morning appointments, difficult. Many survivors use avoidant coping strategies to reduce the impact of that trauma, particularly if they've experienced trauma from the service provider previously. So if that's the sort of response they've had before. So a trauma-informed response might be to provide as much choice as possible about when, where, how often and how long appointments might take. Ask the person what would be helpful. Do they want to be reminded? Would later appointments be better? Where would it be good to meet? So, for example, small enclosed rooms might be triggering. And ask if their past experiences might be impacted attendance. And if so, problem solve together, encouraging choice. So another example, service user displaying aggressive behaviour, shouting and expressing anger. A non-trauma informed might respond, the service user's dangerous, violent, aggressive, has anger management issues, are defiant, difficult, and unwilling to follow the rules or policies. Whereas a trauma-informed understanding would understand that regulating emotions can be difficult once you've been triggered because the rational part of the brain's just gone offline, which can lead experience of feeling helpless, unsafe, or out of control. And engaging in that sort of aggressive behaviour might have been an effective way to protect themselves in the past, and so they continue to use that behaviour. So a trauma-informed response to that: ask, do they need to move to a more private or a quiet space? Remain calm yourself, support the person to ground themselves. Offer support around naming and managing the triggers. Practice breathing and grounding techniques with the person if they're willing and able to do that. But don't try and continue the session until the person's come back into a safe space where they're able to engage socially again. Another one, a service provider colleague displaying mood swings, defensiveness, outbursts, and blaming others. Again, a non-trauma involved response might be, they're not a team player, they're snappy, they're difficult to work with, they're a control freak, bossy, never takes responsible for their behaviour, and are unprofessional. A trauma-informed understanding might be, actually it's common for people working in the care industry to be survivors themselves. That's why they've sought that work, because they know what it's like. Or they might have experienced vicarious trauma due to the nature of the work. It can impact on their ability to regulate emotions, process difficult situations, or cope with stress. Organisations can sometimes create the conditions and dynamics similar to those that they've experienced which have been abusive. Can lead to experiences of burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and stress. And I know there is quite a lot of research going on about this at the moment. Certainly amongst academics, I've come across research and done in this city looking at how better to support carers when they might have this trauma background. A trauma-informed response might be providing ongoing training on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. If you know that this is why you're feeling the way you're feeling, it might make it easier. Provide opportunities for regular support and supervision. Take workforce wellness seriously. Ask staff what they need to feel safe both in and outside of work. Consider conducting an organisational assessment to look about how that might be accomplished, and you can involve them in that. So learn from their experiences. So another challenge, chairs in the reception area, communal area are too close together. Could be to do with the location of the building, locked doors, doors that slam or require buzzers to get through. So a non-trauma informed response may be, there is a limited budget, limited space. It might be an old building that's difficult to change. Old use furniture is the norm. A denial that environmental factors can be triggering. Doors may need to be locked for safety of staff. A trauma-informed understanding of that might be that experiences of hypervigilance can cause increased sensitivity to environmental factor that others might not even notice, which could be the sounds, it could be the way the lighting is, it can be the style of chairs. Locked or buzzing doors can trigger people who've been in hospital, informally or because they were sectioned, or if they spent time in prison. Being in close proximity to others can be re-traumatizing, or it can cause stress or discomfort, especially if they have to share space with their perpetrator. Again, a trauma-informed response might be working with people to identify the environmental triggers within the organisation and adjusting those accordingly. Discuss the environmental factors that can't be controlled, preferably before they visit, so people know what to expect when they come to you for the first time. Make sure people have adequate personal space where they know where the exits are and know where they can find important facilities. So where's the toilet? Where's the bathroom? How do they get a drink of water? Where are the kitchens? Is it appropriate for them to go and use them? And again, ask for feedback about people's experience of your organisation's space and environment. Okay, so those are the 4 of those. Does anyone want to ask any questions about those at the moment? Before we move on to the case studies.
Seems like we're good, Jo.
Okay, good to go. Okay, Val, do you want to share a case study and then I'll share one?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much. Just to let you know that to ensure confidentiality and safety of survivors, their names have been changed and there's no identifying information or details, and all have given their consent for us to share their stories with you.
And sorry, Val, I just was going to say, because I know some people have come in after we issued the trigger warning. So I just want to kind of say that again, because the case studies are very impactful. So again, just be aware of that. Thanks, Val.
No, thanks, Jo. That's a really good reminder. Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mary. This case study highlights issues of familial abuse experienced by a vulnerable older woman. Mary is 73 years old and she's lived in Cornwall with her husband and 2 sons for over 40 years. She's very vulnerable, she's not independently mobile, lacks confidence and self-esteem, and suffers from anxiety and depression due to experiencing several years of domestic abuse. Mary's been isolated at home for many years and has suffered long-term emotional abuse from her husband, who is alcohol dependent. Mary's abuse was further exacerbated by her youngest son and his girlfriend after they moved into her home 2 years ago. The son's girlfriend is very controlling and has been instrumental in ensuring Mary was gaslighted, verbally, financially, and emotionally abused, and at times physically abused. Mary was prevented from going out shopping or seeing her friends. Her husband, son, and girlfriend didn't want to share their food with her, and as a result, she became very underweight and malnourished. Against her will, and there was no discussion about this, her son and girlfriend decided to breed Rottweilers in the home. Mary became terrified of the dogs after being bitten by them several times. This resulted in Mary spending most of her time isolated with her cat in her bedroom. A recent incident involved dog mess in the kitchen that was not cleaned up. She slipped on the mess and fractured her scapula. 2 of the adult dogs and some puppies proceeded to jump on her and attack her. She screamed for help, but no one came for some time. Her son verbally abused her, told her she was a stupid cow, and insisted she got up. Due to her fracture, she couldn't get up by herself, and so her son grabbed her roughly under her arms and shoved her to the side of the room. She was taken to hospital eventually. I think they realized, that she actually needed that help, and was checked over and received treatment for the fracture. She told the nurses about her situation and the abuse she was experiencing and begged them not to send her home. The police were called and a safeguarding referral was made. She has now been living in safe accommodation in a new location and is currently supported by a housing association. Mary settled into her temporary home and she now has her cat, but does not have many of her belongings or her paperwork that she needs. She's new to the area, very nervous about going out, and is not competent at using social media, but is able to talk to her best friend, who thankfully gave her an old phone. She has several health conditions, including osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and high blood pressure, and as I said before, suffered from anxiety and depression. She remains fairly undernourished and currently relies on deliveries of ready meals for food. She has relied on her friend for money, as she was not able to access money from her joint account with her husband, the fear that he would be able to find out where she was. And this is a real issue for people with joint accounts. And I'm glad to say that this issue for Mary has been resolved with the help of her bank, who were very supportive, who have taken measures to keep her location confidentially. And that's about not putting her address, the address on her statement, that kind of thing. Mary would not have been able to do any of this without the support that she actually had. She's often confused and finds it hard to make decisions and act on these. Therefore, she continues to need a high level of emotional and practical support to navigate her way through financial and legal issues, let alone the emotional trauma that she has experienced. She has been relocated to an area which is much more suited to her needs, and she's living now with other women because, again, she was very isolated in the previous accommodation. And she is addressing her social isolation by taking part in groups and getting to know the local area. She's now feeling more settled and empowered to face the future now that her finances in particular have been sorted out, and she is getting support for her trauma. Action is being taken to continue to respond to Mary's support needs. For example, someone to spend one day a week with her to take her to the library and getting to know the new area. She is very concerned about the future, which is understandable, and will be reliant for some time to come on the support that she is gaining. That's a little bit about Mary.
Okay, I'm going to share a case study of Tessa. So Tessa's a 60-year-old woman who's been abused by her partner and the father to 2 of her children for over 20 years. The abuse worsened when she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage in 2019, resulting in full right-hand side paralysis, leaving her wheelchair bound. She was physically, sexually, emotionally, mentally and financially abused by her partner. Tessa was very frightened of her partner. It took her a long time and much courage to reach out to one of her carers about what was happening. The carers made a safeguarding referral and she went on to make further disclosures to her social worker. Cornwall Housing referred her to the Crefter Kerno team, which is a project again within the Women's Centre in Cornwall that helps with accommodation needs. So the team, who after a full risk assessment were able to quickly arrange a joint visit with a social worker because she struggled to speak on the phone. Her partner was under the impression that the Crefter worker there was there to provide advice about the suitability of her current accommodation in conjunction with adult social care. They were able to get the information that Cornwall Housing required to complete the assessment in a way that left Tessa feeling heard, validated and worthy of care and support. After the process was explained, she asked for help to leave her partner. General needs emergency accommodation or refuge options suitable for Tessa's needs were just not available, and as the risk was escalating, a temporary placement in a care home was found while suitable alternative accommodation was sought. Tessa moved under the guise of her needing temporary respite care. When she arrived at the care home, she was relieved to be safe and to be able to sleep without the fear of being attacked at night. Her partner had been preventing carers from preparing meals, saying he'd do it, but actually he hadn't. Tessa looked drawn and malnourished when she arrived at the care home, but after over the 3 months she was there, she became vibrant and happy. Whilst at the care home, Tessa's Crefter worker arranged a new bank account, duplicate identification documents, applied for benefits, addressed sorting out bills and debt management plan that had been arranged by her partner to repay his debts. The worker also set up a new secure email account, helped her order a new phone and contract, and got her set up on Home Choice. Tessa was successful in bidding for a suitable permanent home, and she was assisted to move. Tessa's been referred for specialist support at the Women's Centre, and in the meantime, the crafter worker continues to provide a trusted and safe space for her to talk about her feelings and her emotions, as well as that practical support. She's felt comfortable speaking about her suicide ideation, which she was previously ashamed of, but now she understands and accepts, and she's feeling positive about the future. Val, do you want to share?
Yes, I'm happy. Everybody's happy for us to carry on. This is Gladys, and this case study, I hope, illustrates repeated patterns of abuse from childhood into adult life, and the impact of dementia from a family member, and the difficulties in the context of her childhood and adolescent abuse, and the lack of awareness of services. So I think it's very important for us to keep remembering the context of survivors that they had to live in, and the what was expected of them when they were living in those times. Gladys is an 86-year-old woman who's living in a retirement home currently, she was currently, and partially blind. She's had cancer twice, a double mastectomy, and has a pacemaker. She's painfully thin, and her weight had gone down from a size 23 to size 8. Gladys's parents were both abusive in their own ways. Her mother treated her like a servant, and her father was extremely strict. Neither of them showed her love. She has suffered from birth with abandonment, neglect, and abuse, and she's often had to resort, when she was a child, to eating food from dustbins. Her family background set patterns of abuse in her life that she suffered from into her 80s. Gladys is, as a result, very OCD with cleanliness and tidiness, and she swings from being both fearful, subservient, to defiant. Gladys married her first husband when she was very young. I believe she was 15, because she was pregnant with her first child. And of course, in those days, that was totally unacceptable, and people were forced into marrying. This marriage, although quite happy in the beginning, ended with considerable abuse, as her husband became an alcoholic and had several affairs, mainly with her friends. Whilst she was in the army, just after they married, he was accused of rape overseas and spent a few years in prison there. He spent 2 more spells in prison for assault. They subsequently divorced, leaving her as a single parent with 2 small children. Gladys also experienced a lot of abuse from her second husband, who she later discovered was gay, and married her to present a facade of respectability and heterosexuality that was not uncommon in the 1950s and 60s. He was arrested several times for abuse against men and boys. Her second husband developed dementia in later years and became both physically and emotionally violent. And unfortunately, it got to the point where he threw her and the children out of their house 2.5 years ago. Gladys was actually 82 years old when that happened. Do you imagine being thrown out of your family home, at 82 years old and having to start again? Her husband had perpetrated lots of violence against her, including punching her in the face, breaking her glasses, and lots of other violent acts. He was an academic and lecturer, and her children had all been well educated. Gladys, however, was a trained cook. She was uneducated and always felt inferior to her family. Her husband's family were very wealthy, and she found it hard to accept where she is now in her life because she was used to a better life. She is alienated from her children and grandchildren, who've either moved and are out of contact or seem to have taken their father's side. And this is something we come across a lot with older survivors, that they are completely isolated from their children and their families. Gladys has very little money, and her care package from the hospital had stopped. She has extreme mood swings and is very talkative and repeats herself constantly. It is suspected that partly that she would have bipolar or ADHD, may be due to the trauma that she has experienced during her lifetime. She's regularly depressed and feels she has nothing to live for, and hopes each day that she doesn't wake up. I personally visited several times so that she could get some emotional support, and this support took place in her own environment. Gladys didn't want to be referred to the Women's Centre or talk to a counsellor on the phone, and preferred to talk face to face. And in fact, of course, she was blind, so she couldn't use the phone or social media or anything like that. I have to say, very sadly, Gladys died alone earlier this year without her children or family around her, and I don't know whether they actually even know that she's passed away. So sadly, that's Gladys. Thank you.
I'm just going to share a case study of Margaret. So Margaret has a learning disability due to brain damage at birth. She's had heart attacks and kidney failure throughout her life, and she currently attends hospital 3 times a week for kidney dialysis. She met her partner when she was 17. She has 2 children and a large family, but doesn't have any contact with them now. They moved to Cornwall a few years ago. Margaret spoke to her carers about the abuse she'd suffered for many years from her partner. Her partner financially abused her, taking complete charge of her benefits. He controlled everything. She said she spent a lot of her life living, but looking at 4 walls. She didn't want to talk about any other abuse she'd suffered at this stage. She was very unhappy and had tried to take her own life a few times. Assisted by her carers, she left her abuser when she had to go into hospital. She went into a refuge temporarily while accommodation that was suitable for her disability could be found. She feels safe where she's living, but it's just not suitable for her as a disabled woman. Although there is 1 room in the refuge with disabled facilities, the room was already occupied. A shower is of vital importance to Margaret, but if she wants to have a shower, she has to ask the person in the adapted room if she can use the shower there, which she finds really upsetting and problematic. She needs accessible furniture for her to live comfortably, and the hospital bed and chair in her own room are unsuitable for her needs. Margaret has kidney dialysis at the hospital 3 times a week. As a result, she misses out on some of the daily social activities at the refuge. She feels lonely and isolated as she can't go out independently. She misses her dog, who can't live at the refuge as is not house trained, although she also thinks her partner wouldn't agree to let her have it anyway. Margaret's very concerned about her future. She would like to live in a flat with accessible disabled facilities and support for her to live independently, preferably with her dog, but accommodation such as this is rare. The only place she's been offered wasn't suitable for her disability. Her health and mobility restrict her independence, which creates loneliness and isolation. Her only trips out are to the hospital. She would like to have a befriender to help her steer through life's obstacles, to talk to on a regular basis and help her plan and arrange activities to keep her occupied. So those are our case studies. Are we going to have a break now?
Yeah, I think before questions, let's take a short break. I'll stop recording now as well, so the questions people can feel comfortable with. So we'll come back at, should we say 5 minutes, or at 21 past 11? If anyone wants to just go grab a cup of something, we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Okay, lovely.